You clicked on this video, so are you prepared to take a walk on the dark side of history with me on Moments in History? In this episode, we will delve into the worst punishments inflicted upon men and women in ancient Greece. How did these cruel punishments shape the culture and beliefs of ancient Greece? Prepare yourself for a chilling journey through history as we uncover the harsh realities of punishment in ancient Greece. 1. Death by hemlock. Imagine being forced to drink a toxic potion that would paralyze your body and shut down your respiratory system. This was the reality for some people in ancient Greece who were sentenced to death by hemlock. Hemlock is a highly poisonous plant that contains a potent neurotoxin called conein. It grows in many parts of the world, including ancient Greece, where it was used as a method of execution for certain crimes, particularly those related to political or religious offenses. Death by hemlock was considered one of the most brutal and inhumane forms of execution in ancient Greece. It was often reserved for those who were seen as a threat to the state or the ruling authorities, and was used as a way to discourage others from speaking out against the government. While the practice of using hemlock as a method of execution is thankfully no longer used today, it serves as a chilling reminder of the brutal punishments that were inflicted upon those who dared to challenge the status quo in ancient Greece. 2. Crucifixion. Imagine you're standing in a crowded square in ancient Greece, watching as a person is dragged to a wooden cross and tied or nailed to it. You can hear their screams as the executioners raise the cross, leaving the victim to hang there, gasping for air. This is crucifixion, one of the most brutal and inhumane methods of execution in history. The process of crucifixion was slow and agonizing. As the victim hung on the cross, their body weight would cause their chest to collapse, making it difficult to breathe. They would struggle to keep their head up, gasping for air in between the searing pain of their wounds. Crucifixion wasn't just a method of execution. It was also a form of public spectacle. The authorities wanted to make an example out of the victim, to show the crowds what would happen to those who dared to oppose them. While we often associate crucifixion with the death of Jesus Christ, it was actually a common form of execution in ancient Greece and other cultures. It was typically reserved for those who were seen as a threat to the state, such as rebels, seditionists, or traitors. 3. Blinding. Get ready to cringe, because we're about to dive into one of the most brutal forms of punishment in ancient Greece. This horrific practice involved the removal or destruction of a person's eyes, leaving them in a state of permanent darkness and dependence on others for care. Blinding was typically carried out in a public setting as a means of striking fear into the hearts of those who crossed the authorities. The actual method of blinding varied depending on the culture and time period, but it involved gouging out the eyes with a sharp instrument or burning them with a hot iron. In some cases, acid was poured into the eyes to destroy them completely, which sounds terrible, doesn't it? As unreal as it may seem, blinding was a real punishment in ancient times, and serves as a stark reminder of the extreme measures that were taken to maintain control and order. 4. Castration. If you are a man watching this, then I want to ask you a quick question. Would you have $50,000 or your testicles? Many of you will choose testicles. Well, they are considered jewels for men, aren't they? Imagine losing them. Castration was one of the most feared and devastating punishments in ancient Greece, and it's not hard to see why it was a punishment where men's testicles are cut off. This brutal punishment was often used to control male slaves or to punish men for sexual crimes, and the procedure itself was nothing short of horrific. A trained physician, or, in some cases, non-medical personnel using crude instruments would remove or destroy a man's testicles, leaving him unable to father children, and oftentimes causing significant emotional trauma. The consequences of castration were irreversible and could have lifelong effects on the victim. It's difficult to even imagine the pain and suffering that must have been endured. Suffice to say, this was not a punishment to be taken lightly. 5. Forced labor in the mines. Imagine being stripped of your freedom and being forced to work day in and day out in a dark, dreary mine. Your body aches, your hands are calloused, and your spirit broken. Men who were convicted of certain crimes, such as theft or murder, could be sentenced to work in the mines, which was a grueling and dangerous job that often led to premature death. The mines were a treacherous place with dangers lurking at every turn. The air was thick with dust and toxic fumes, and the tunnels were narrow and claustrophobic. It was a place where the only thing certain was uncertainty, and the slightest mistake could mean the difference between life and death. But it wasn't just the physical labor that was torturous. The mental anguish of being trapped in the mines with no hope of escape was equally unbearable. Day after day, week after week, with no end in sight, the miners were forced to toil away, their hopes and dreams slowly fading away with each passing day. Forced labor in the mines was a punishment that was reserved for the most heinous crimes, and it's not hard to see why. It's a grim reminder of the cruel and unforgiving nature of the ancient world. 6. Stoning. You may have seen some flop starts on stage getting hit by tomatoes or eggs in movies, but in ancient Greece, there was a punishment similar to that to some degree. As its name suggests, stoning was a form of execution that involved pelting the convicted person with stones until they died. This brutal punishment was reserved for crimes such as adultery, blasphemy, and murder. Stoning was not only a gruesome but also a humiliating punishment. The condemned person would be stripped of their clothes and buried up to their waist in the ground, making it impossible for them to escape. Then the crowd would gather around them, throwing stones of various sizes and weights, aiming for the head and face to cause maximum damage. The goal was not to kill the person instantly, but to make them suffer for as long as possible. Stoning was a punishment that was applied to both men and women, but it was more common for women to be convicted of crimes that warranted this punishment. Adultery, for instance, was considered a more severe offense for women than for men, and it was often punished by stoning. 7. Drowning. If you think being submerged in water is just a refreshing swim, think again. In ancient Greece, drowning was not only a punishment but also a method of execution. It was used as a punishment for a wide range of crimes, including adultery, murder, and theft. Drowning wasn't just about being held underwater until you couldn't breathe anymore. The ancient Greeks had a more creative way of executing this punishment. They would tie the victim's hands and feet and throw them into a body of water with a weight tied to them. The weight ensured that the victim would sink and drown to death. This punishment was not only terrifying for the victim, but also for the witnesses. Imagine watching someone being thrown into the water, knowing that there was no way for them to escape. I hope you feel lucky not witnessing it in the modern world. 8. Burning at the stake. Imagine being tied to a wooden stake, with flames licking at your feet and smoke filling your lungs. This was the fate of those who were condemned to burning at the stake in ancient Greece. It was one of the most gruesome and terrifying forms of punishment, reserved for those accused of crimes such as heresy, witchcraft, and treason. The process of burning at the stake involved tying the accused to the stake and piling wood and kindling around them. Once the fire was lit, it could take hours for the person to die, as they were slowly consumed by the flames. The heat was so intense that the person's body would often burst into flames, leaving nothing but ashes and charred bones behind. The accused were often subjected to public humiliation and shaming before being burned. 9. Laceration. If you thought getting a paper cut was painful, you should think after you hear this. Laceration, also known as scourging or flogging, was a brutal punishment where a person was whipped or beaten with a whip or a rod until their skin was torn apart and bleeding. This was a punishment reserved for serious crimes like murder, treason, or rebellion. The executioners, often strong and burly men, would use their strength to strike the victim's back, buttocks and legs with full force, causing deep gashes and cuts in the skin. The pain was insane, and the bleeding was continuous. In some cases, the laceration was so severe that it could cause permanent disfigurement, disability, or even death. This punishment was not only physically agonizing, but also mentally humiliating, as the victim was often stripped naked and publicly flogged in front of a crowd. The purpose was to shame and deter others for committing similar crimes. 10. Exile to a deserted island. Imagine being ripped from your home, your family, and everything familiar, and then being sent to a deserted island with nothing but the clothes on your back. That was the punishment for exile in ancient Greece. Being exiled to a deserted island meant being cut off from civilization and left to fend for oneself in a harsh, unforgiving environment. It was a slow and painful death sentence, as there was little to no chance of survival. This punishment was often reserved for those who had committed crimes against the state or for those who posed a threat to society. One can only imagine the psychological trauma and mental anguish that must have accompanied this punishment. It was a lonely and isolating existence, and there was no hope of ever returning to one's former life. The fear of being exiled was enough to keep many in line and deter them from breaking the law. It was a harsh reminder that even the slightest infraction could lead to a life of misery and despair. That concludes the top 10 worst punishments in ancient Greece. There are several other punishments in history that are unheard of, but these punishments are some of the worst kinds. The punishments in history to women were subjected to public humiliation and prostitution mostly, whereas punishments to men were subjected more towards slavery and physical punishments like crucifixion. I hope you guys liked this video. Make sure to tell us which punishments you think are most horrifying. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on future videos. Bye, have a good day.